When you're teaching a tough topic that requires students to learn a ton of information to really get it, it's not always easy to figure out how much of a class should be lecture and how much should be active learning. Striking that balance can feel like walking a tightrope. What are strategies faculty can use to find that balance, and how do you respond to faculty and student objections to these active learning strategies? Welcome to Teach Well, Learn Well, a podcast series highlighting the scholarship being published by members of the University of Tennessee Health Science Center's community about effective ways to teach. I'm Tom Lochner of UTHSC's Teaching and Learning Center. Each month, we interview members of our faculty about their research and its impact on the higher education community. Today, we're chatting with Dr. Rachel Barenie, an assistant professor in the College of Pharmacy. She, along with Caroline Paul and Allie Stanford from the UT Health Science Center and Aaron Holmes from the University of Mississippi, wrote a paper called Implementing 5 Evidence-Based Learning Principles into the Pharmacy Law course, which was published in Currents in Pharmacy Teaching and Learning. In their work, they lay out 5 practical strategies for faculty so they can get students more involved in their own learning, helping them not just understand the material, but actually use it in real-world practice. With us today is Rachel Barenie. Rachel is an assistant professor in the College of Pharmacy. Welcome, Rachel.
Thank you so much, Tom. I'm excited to be here with you today and talk some pharmacy law. It's one of my favorite topics.
We're glad to have you. So to start us out, can you talk a little bit about your paper and what it is that you were trying to say and why this is important to you?
Absolutely. So in short, it was a commentary, and I really focused on 5 ways to teach pharmacy law that are evidence-based and give specific examples to the readers on how they can implement this in their pharmacy law course. Now, I love pharmacy law. I love teaching pharmacy law. Something that really motivates me is when I see the light bulb go off for a student when they finally get it. Some other motivating factors, though, a lot of students are going to have to take a pharmacy law exam to get their pharmacist license. When they pass that exam and they come back and tell me they passed, thank you for the help, it's highly motivating to me. Also, though, when they're in practice, I want them to be practice ready. I want them to go into their pharmacy, whatever their practice site is, and be confident they know the law. And I see that as a big responsibility of mine.
So you mentioned 5 strategies that you talk about in your paper, and the first one has to do with practice questions. And interestingly, we just talked to some faculty in College of Medicine a couple months ago about their use of practice questions. So can you talk about how you use practice questions and how that's helping your students?
Absolutely. So a lot of law that they have to know, it's rote memorization. Some of it's simply knowing the rule of law. How long do we have to keep our records for? 2 years. Simple things like that. They simply have to know. But there are other concepts that are more complex. So here's an example. Something they just have to know are the schedules of the drugs. So FDA approves a lot of drugs. Some of those drugs are controlled substances. DEA regulates them. They put them into one of 5 schedules under federal law. For example, oxycodone's a Schedule 2. They just have to know that's a Schedule 2. But a more complex concept is, for example, how they take an inventory of their scheduled drugs. So DEA requires a pharmacy to do an inventory every 2 years. The complex part of this, though, is that it depends on how you do an inventory of the drug, depends on, in part, is the bottle open or closed? What schedule is it? And this all relates back to the practice problems, because it's one thing to know oxycodone's a Schedule 2. It's one thing to know, if the bottle is closed, then I have to have an exact count of the inventory. It's another thing to walk into the pharmacy as the pharmacist or pharmacist in charge one day, and you have to do the inventory on that day and see all these bottles and know, how do I inventory them? Practice problems close that gap. Practice problems take what we just have to know from rote memorization to be able to actually apply it. There are nuances that get teased out when you work at practice problems that either reinforce or maybe show an opportunity of something I didn't exactly know how to apply this, and it furthers the learning.
So these are sort of cases, like case studies that you do in class, and so do students actually role play the cases?
So these are more, I will give them hypotheticals, and then they have to apply the rule of law that applies in that scenario and answer the question based on that. So I just looked up, as I was preparing for this, I looked up the first year I taught this course in 2021, I had about 210 practice problems in the whole course, which is about 44 lecture hours. Last year in 2024, I have 509 practice problems, practice questions that typically will have anywhere from 5 to upwards of 20 or 30 per lecture that I do. So of the 44 hours of lecture that I give, 40 have practice problems in them. So almost every lecture I do has practice problems, and the students crave them. They want them. It helps them understand. It helps them confirm their understanding when they get it right. And we build on those small wins, which are our practice problems in class.
So one of the things I hear often from faculty is that they would love to do more of these active learning kind of things in class, but they need to deliver content. And you can't be more active in class without pulling back on the amount of content that you have. So how do you address the kind of criticisms faculty have about taking away content and lectures for classes?
I appreciate the balance and trying to figure it out. But the short of it is a student that doesn't have the opportunity to work practice problems won't fully understand the content. Practice problems are key. They are a must. You have to build in time for them to apply the knowledge, or you're simply giving them a bunch of information that they're not going to know what to go do with. You have to build time. Now, it's a balance. How much time? That's the real question. How much time do I give to this? Because there's a certain amount of content that must be delivered. But if you simply don't give them the time to apply it and really synthesize and digest it, which is what they do by working the practice problems, you can give them all the content in the world, but it's not going to matter.
I always think of it sort of like you in class provide enough content to give them the structure, and then they can it's something for them to hang everything on to. So you don't have to give them all the content because they're not going to remember all of it anyway. And you're giving them that structure to add that content later.
I agree completely. And you can also, if you're really effective using them, you can use the practice problems to tease out some more of that content and those nuances about how it may apply one way or another that just simply saying it and lecturing it may not be fully appreciated.
So the second concept you talk about is this idea of distributed learning, and you talk about its effect on long-term memory. Can you talk about distributed learning and what is that relationship with long-term memory?
I'd say distributive learning is a fancy term for repetition and making sure you're practicing something over and over and over. The more you practice it, the more likely you are to remember it. For example, in the course, coming back to the schedules of the drugs, I always harp on this with the students, but we have weekly drug scheduling quizzes, and I do it weekly, so they have to come back to it every single week and relook at it. And we do that over a whole 16-week period. So the more times they come back, the more they re-review, the more they work with the content, the more likely they are to really retain it. And that's our goal, is retention, so they can transfer that into their practice site with what they're doing and ultimately provide the best care for patients that they can.
And then you talk about interleaved practice. I've never heard that term, so can you talk a little bit about what that is? And then I have a follow-up question about that.
Absolutely. So another fancy term, and really how I break that down is think about interleaved practice as switching gears, going from one concept to another. So in law, that could be I'm switching from state law to federal law, or maybe it's I'm switching from how to do an inventory to reviewing what's required on a prescription. You're switching gears in between different, basically rules of law or different concepts to make yourself have to retrieve that concept when you go back and forth between different concepts. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay. And ideally, so for example, as we build in law and we layer in more and more content, we have to make sure we bring back that content we learned before. So instead of going over a concept A over and over and over and then being done with it, okay, let's go over concept A, build the foundation for concept A, then we move to concept B. But when we do practice for concept B, we bring back concept B and go over concept A. And then you build A, B, C, D, and you keep going over it all and switching gears. Because, for example, when they take their boards, it's not going to be, here's all your questions on how to do an inventory. Here's all your questions on what goes on a prescription. It's going to be, inventory, script, when do you do DUR, what's record keeping, when can I give immunizations? It will be all over the place. And it's just like that in practice. A pharmacist is going from talking to a patient to talking to a provider to talking to their team about all different things, and they have to switch. Law is touching it all. And they have to be able to switch those gears quickly. So that's kind of how I think about that interleave practice.
I think of myself as an instructor, even just in general, I'm a very linear thinker. And so the idea of switching amongst topics, I think, might even be challenging for me. And then as a learner, I also am very linear. So you're sort of introducing a very nonlinear way of teaching. But I think the way you just explained it sort of is both of those, right? You're being very purposeful about how you do that, but you're not exhausting things before you move on to the next topic.
Absolutely. You want to make sure you build the foundation.
Yeah.
So they can understand those things that you layer in, but also that coming back and toggling and switching gears, the gear switching part is helping them connect the dots and how these things relate together. Kind of think of that, maybe bring it up to a 10,000 foot view, and learning the foundation is the 10-foot view.
So as an instructor, what is the challenge of designing a course that you're interleaving like this?
Well, the challenge is if I don't build a good foundation, I can't expect them at the end to understand how all this pieces together, and they have to. So I think in part, it's building good objectives so I know and they know what we want to get out of this class session. It's making sure I don't teach a concept that they need to know XYZ before, but I expect them to, I guess, be there now with. It's making sure that they have those fundamentals before you're expecting them to apply it. And here's another example. I have to teach them what goes on the prescription before we start talking about some of these maybe other limitations that may exist under state law. Or you have to teach them about how drugs are approved and how the practice of pharmacy is regulated in general before we start getting into, well, what can the board do? What can the DEA do? We have to understand this fundamental framework of regulation before we get into the weeds on what everybody's specific role is. Does that make sense?
Yeah, perfectly. I think what I hear is a common thing amongst everything that you've talked about is that it's really a focus on more just the content and memorization of the content, but you're trying to really get into deeper learning and not just the what, but the how and the why and all those other questions.
Absolutely. And I will say this too. In practice, when they're future pharmacists, they're not going to know every answer. And sometimes they're going to have to go look it up, or sometimes the law just isn't going to speak to it. So I'm trying to help them build these critical thinking skills so when it is a gray area, they can see, well, what does the law tell me I can do? What does it tell me I can't do? And what's something reasonable if it doesn't speak exactly to this? And when do I need a gut check to be like, well, wait, maybe I need to ask or look something up or get some more guidance on something versus when can I feel confident that my practice complies? Because at the end of the day, that's what I want them to be able to do is confidently go out into practice and know that they either know what the law is or they know where to find it so they can comply.
Right, because the knowledge is changing, right? The laws change
Rapidly.
constantly.
Yes.
Knowledge is a commodity. You can always go look that stuff up.
Absolutely.
You just need to know how to get to it and what it means.
Absolutely.
And how to interpret it.
Correct. And in the course, it's building that foundation so, of course, they can pass their boards, but it's building those critical thinking skills so when the law doesn't tell them the answer, they can still be able to figure it out.
So you talk about self-explanation.
Yeah.
Which I love that concept. When I was in undergraduate and graduate school, I took a mess of statistics classes. And I always did well in the class, but I never felt that I really understood it. And it wasn't until I ended up teaching it that I really felt like I had a good understanding of what all that stuff meant. So you talk about self-explanation in your course. My thought was, though, that in a course, again, that has so much content and all these other things that you're doing, what is the challenge and how do you structure this in a way that, again, is not taking away more content and is giving you time to teach? And a follow-up question, is do students then say, well, we're just teaching ourselves?
A lot to unpack there. So when we think self-explanation, we're really thinking the student giving us their rationale of how they got here. What was their thought process? And I would say how I incorporate that in the course, it's very informal. Here's an example. A lot of times, every student that gets less than a 70 on the first couple exams, I'll request to meet with them. And as part of that meeting, I incorporate, well, what were you thinking? How did you get here? How did you think this would make you successful in both studying, but how did you approach this specific question, both in how they read the STEM and read the question, but also what issues did you spot? What law did you think needed to be applied? What law did you think didn't? So I incorporate it in that aspect. It's very informal, if you will. It's not I'm having them write a written response for 100 questions and having to go grade it. No, I get it. That's just not feasible. I think that's probably, though, people's initial response as to what they're thinking. Well, how do I incorporate this? So student one-on-one meetings is one way I incorporate it. Another one is we give the students the opportunity to review all their exams. So when they go to their exam review session, they can see the questions they miss. I go to those. And I sit there with the student, and when they're able to see the question and see what they answered, I sit there and talk with them. Tell me what you were thinking. So it's more one-on-one.
Mm.
I do struggle trying to figure out a way to effectively do this in the class, because sometimes it is that balance of there's a certain amount of content and questions that we need to get through. And when I can tell maybe it's just one or two students that are really struggling to get through that concept, I say, let's take it offline. Let's have a meet. Come to office hours. Office hours are the third way I kind of do this more informally. I feel like the self-explanation really helps those that maybe are more challenged in law to really kind of get up to speed and get more confident with the subject matter. They need more help on that. How did I get here? That thought process, that issue spotting process. So I try to incorporate this more in working with them one-on-one, either one-on-one student meetings when they come to office hours or going to exam review. I don't, though, currently have any way that they are writing up a response and submitting it and then me reviewing it. I find that self-explanation, it's really most effective, and this is just my personal experience, when I'm working with them one-on-one in real time. If they've written a response and then now I'm reviewing it, I may not know exactly, well, what did they mean? And then I'm sending back a thought, and it's best to work on it in real time where we can have that open dialogue back and forth, get those clarifications made to get to the end, if you will, in real time.
Excellent. So your next one is elaborative interrogation. So I'm wondering if you could first talk a little bit about what that is, and then I have some follow-ups to that.
This sounds good. Another fancy term. It's not just your thought process, but it's how did you get to the right answer and why is this one right? So thinking on more the correctness of it as opposed to what did I do? So when we're thinking about that elaborative interrogation, that why is this correct? Not just how did you get there? I feel like I'm probably a little bit more effective with this because when I do practice problems, it's not just what was the correct answer? Why? Why is this right? And I have them tell me in the class their explanation, and then we can go over it, and that student individually benefits from them, but the group benefits because they're hearing that rationale, especially if it's a right rationale, but also if it's not, we need to correct it, because in law, it's not just important to get to the right answer, but to make sure you got there for the right reason. Here's an example. When we think about drugs and when they expire, our Schedule 3 and 4 drugs expire in 6 months, have 5 refills. Schedule 5 drugs, though, will have up to 1 year. So it's important to know, though, sometimes you can guess and still get to the right answer. So I'm trying to think of bringing back that example. I may go a little bit into the weeds here a second, but if we partially fill a Schedule 5 drug, that shortens the life to 6 months. Well, if a student thought when they're answering a question, if they didn't know the schedule but somehow got to the right 6-month answer, that's where I could use this concept to dig in. Well, is it because you knew it was a Schedule 3 or 4 and had the 6-month expiration, or was it because you thought it was a Schedule 5 and kind of went down this partial fill track here? So it's that aspect of it. It's not just knowing they had 6 months, but why? Because there's different routes you could get there. We want to make sure they take the right route, because if the facts change and they take that same path, they could end up somewhere else. So I guess that's where I think this elaborative interrogation, really, why did you get to this answer, is so important. So we know they get to the right place for the right reason.
So it seems like, and I think a common thing with a lot of things that you've been talking about today, when you think about Bloom's taxonomy, right? You're really at the top of that pyramid there with some really deep thinking, bringing thoughts together, maybe some even original thought about maybe some things that you didn't think about as the students explain things of how different things work together.
Absolutely. So when I think of the rote memorization in law, I'm thinking we're kind of at those lower tiers of Bloom's, that recall. But this asking them why is pushing them to analyze and evaluate, which puts us more at the top of the pyramid of our Bloom's. So forcing them to really dive in deeper and have more of that responsibility and that onus for getting to that answer and why they got there.
So you've only been teaching this course for a relatively few years now. You've done a lot in just those few years. What's next? Where do you take this going forward?
There's so much next, huh? There's so much next. So, a couple things. Number one, our College of Pharmacy is really about to implement a huge curricular revision. So, pharmacy law in this course, as we know it, will only exist until basically fall of 2028. And moving forward in the new curriculum, it will be fewer number of credit hours, but we're going to more of an active learning model. So what I'm working on now is trying to really tease out which concepts are our foundational knowledge that I can give them beforehand to prepare and get ready that they can digest on their own, so that when they come to class, it's all that active learning. It's all that practice. It's all that application. We piloted this in our board prep course this last April. So our students that were about to go and graduate, when they came back for their board review, I had some 9 total hours of law with them. Well, our hours together were all practice problems. I gave them 10 practice problems. We worked them all together in real time. That is what I envision law moving towards. Now, my challenge is going to be these P4s that are days away from graduation. They had the course, they've had APPEs, they've honed the skill. It was so exciting to see the level of thought and curiosity and just evaluating. Like, they were just so meaningfully working through them. They'd come so far in learning law and being able to kind of go back and forth and have this really meaningful dialogue. It was like I was talking to my peers, not my students at this point. I'm trying to figure out, how do I get my students to that level, but earlier in the curriculum? That's what I'm trying to figure out, because that's what the law course is going to look like. How do I really help them accelerate their learning so we can get there fast enough? I don't want them to be there days away from graduation. I want them to be there days away from going out on their APPE experiences. So that's kind of my challenge over the next couple years, is how do I accomplish that? Because I want to feel how I felt preparing them, and iron sharpens iron, and they were at a level that I just was so impressed and so proud that it felt like a huge accomplishment, and they were proud of themselves. I want that happening earlier.
So just for clarification, you mentioned a couple times APPEs. Can you
Yes.
say real quick what that is?
Yes, sorry. APPEs, that is when they go on their experiential rotations in the final year. They have about 10 or 12 rotations that they'll go on, and that's that final year of pharmacy school. They are out at their practice sites working. There's no more didactic. It's all experiential.
Got it.
And they are basically doing almost everything the pharmacists can do here in Tennessee.
I thought it was interesting. You talked about your being able to see their passion and that deep learning and trying to get that early on in their academic career here. It'd be interesting to see too, if because of the way that you're teaching them and getting to that deeper learning, if those skills, the other skills, the soft skills, so to speak, if they're able to transfer those to the other classes that they're taking. So I don't know what are the classes they take, but X class, all of a sudden they're asking those deep kind of questions that you're trying to get them to think about in your own class.
I hope so. And the other thing too is, as part of this new curriculum, part of the law they'll learn will actually come P1 year. And we're integrating law more throughout the whole curriculum. And I think those critical thinking skills they'll use in law would ideally transfer to some of their other more clinical focused content courses, but also their critical thinking skills in those other courses will translate back into law.
Yeah.
So hopefully there's that synergy created with that, that complex, that critical thinking skills that they continue to develop throughout the curriculum.
So what are the next steps?
I'm trying to figure all that out, Tom. That was a lot. Tom, that was a lot.
That was a lot.
But I think, I have about 3 years left where I will deliver pharmacy law kind of as I've done the last 4 years or so. And each year I'm looking forward and trying to figure out what can be condensed, what needs to be expanded. My goal is to get that rote memorization stuff, give it to them as in a most simplistic form as I can, in the most compressed form as possible, because that's you just memorized it. You knew it or you didn't. Part of law is that. But then to really expand this application, I want to push them. I want to stretch them as far as I can, so when they go to take their boards and they go and practice, they're ready. They feel confident. They know it, and they feel like they're really good in their training and just go out and make us proud and make themselves proud.
That's great, Rachel. I really appreciate the passion that you have for what you're doing. I've heard from students how much they like having you as a professor, so you're doing a great job, and whatever you're doing is certainly reaching them. I love reading this article and just really digging deep into different ways of learning and how you're really incorporating some of these concepts. So I really want to thank you for your time, and I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Tom. I appreciate you having me, and my students' success is my success. So thank you again.
All right, great. And that is this month's episode of Teach Well, Learn Well. I'm Tom Lochner of the Teaching and Learning Center at the University of Tennessee Health Science Center. Until next time.